So Maclay emphasized the influence that the culture of democracy had upon the young United States. So here, note that there's something different going on at the beginning of the 19th century, let's say the first half of the 19th century, than what took place in the United States in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the United States came into being out of various traditions coming together. We talked about republicanism. We talked about liberalism. We talked about the Great Awakening and the influence that Reformed theology had upon the character of Americans in the 18th and 19th century. But one of the things Maclay says that's going to take place in the 19th century is the greatest influence upon the American soul is going to be the influence of democracy. And here Maclay references Tocqueville and Tocqueville's Democracy in America, this great work on how democracy shapes the American regime, but how it also shapes our internal life as democratic citizens. How democracy shapes the way that we think about the world, shapes the way that we feel about the world, what we desire within the world. Tocqueville says that the democratic person takes on the mentality, I think, therefore I am. So the I, the one person, becomes central to the whole political experience. And is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, we would hope, right, and we live in a democratic age, that you lend over power, empowerment to the individual, you give that individual opportunity, you give that individual a free will, and they're going to employ that free will in a way that's going to make the world better. Certainly, Tocqueville was hopeful that there are some aspects of democracy that could lead to human flourishing. However, he was always worried about this element in democracy that might lead us in the wrong direction, and that's the following. When, as individuals, we have the opportunity to make decisions on our own, are we at peace with those decisions? Do we feel comfortable about making those decisions? And Tocqueville says no. Tocqueville says the more that everything is focused upon ourselves, the more alone we feel in the world, and the more we turn to others to direct a course of action for us. So Tocqueville says this could be a great age of democratic liberation, but the tendency is for us to pay deference to the majority, to the multitude, and the majority of the multitude can sometimes make very, very bad decisions. One of those bad decisions becomes central to the American experience in the first half of the 19th century, and that's the extension of the institution of slavery. The embrace by a democratic people of its continuance further and further west. Rather than being put on its course to its ultimate extinction, many Americans come to see slavery as a positive good. Well, how could they come to see slavery as such a thing? So one of the important thinkers that I want you to read that I think gives an argument for the institution of slavery is a man named John C. Calhoun. And I've assigned to you his piece, A Disquisition on Government. And I want to go through that piece very deliberately, and I want to tie back to what I just said about the democratic personality. And you can see in Calhoun's argument why it would be a very powerful argument for an individual who was going to embrace slavery. Calhoun says that if you get to the heart and soul of democracy, you recognize that at its core is this idea of liberty, that we ought to be free to choose to do what we want to do. But we also live in communities, and sometimes those communities encroach upon us and tell us what we can and cannot do. Here, Calhoun was very worried about a federal government that would have a set of federal laws in which those laws would be passed by national majorities, and they would encroach upon the livelihood of localities or sections of the country. Calhoun was very concerned about this. So Calhoun, in this argument, Disquisition on Government, says we need to secure for ourselves our local liberty by allowing for there to be a local check on the power of national government, what he calls a concurrent majority that is able to rule over itself, over its own local area. This idea of a concurrent majority that would check the tyranny of a national majority, he hoped would allow for the preservation of slavery in the South. So let me come back to how I began this segment. Do we as Democrats, Do we as Democrats think that democracy means that we have the liberty to do whatever we will because we've willed it? Or ought there to be a check on the power of us? Ought there to be a check on our ability to think something right that is wrong? And that's going to be a very, very important idea or question as we move to our next two readings, or reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, where we see the ugliness of slavery firsthand. And then secondly, Frederick Douglass's speech on the 4th of July and what American institutions ought to mean but have not meant for a large part of the African American population.